Hey guys, I'm Georgia and welcome back, or if you're new here, welcome. I used to do a series about once a month on my channel where I would share the story, the background and the victims of a different serial killer. But as time went on, I kind of realised the direction I wanted my channel to go in. I realised the power of becoming an advocate for victims of true crime, and as a result, my serial killer series has kind of taken a seat on the back burner. It's just not really where I want to spend my time and energy nowadays whilst working. But saying that, every so often I do come across a story that's kind of intertwined with one of my cases, or I watch a documentary and a story comes up that I just have to look more into, I have to research deeper. And I was actually researching poisoning for a case that I will probably film for my channel at some point towards the end of the year, and I came across the story of Graham Young, an English serial killer who is also sometimes known as the teacup poisoner or the St Albans poisoner. As you can probably figure out, poison was Graham Young's weapon of choice, a weapon that is usually more associated with female killers. I find the psychology behind this case really interesting because it's just not something you see all too often. Graham Frederick Young was born on September 7th, 1947 in Neaston, North London to his parents Fred and Margaret Young. Sadly, Margaret died not long after Graham's birth after developing pleurisy, and as a result, both Graham and his older sister Winifred were sent to family members to be raised. Graham was pretty much raised by his aunt and uncle, who he said he had a lovely childhood with. The family was reunited years later when Fred would go on to remarry a woman called Molly, who would become Graham's stepmum. But even then, Graham and his father were never particularly close. Fred was said to be generally quite a detached man, but nothing I read really suggested he was abusive in any way. Him and Graham just never really had that much of a close relationship, probably because Graham didn't spend his childhood with him. But the family was generally quite happy. They plodded along at least until 1961, when the Young family seemed to be hit with a mysterious illness, what they assumed to be a particularly nasty sickness bug. In the early 1960s, Molly started to suffer with vomiting, diarrhoea and excruciating stomach pain, an illness she couldn't quite seem to budge. But then Fred started to suffer with similar symptoms as well, and the family began to have some questions about what it was that was plaguing them, about whether or not this really was a bug, because it just didn't seem to be going anywhere. Around this time, Graham Young was 14 years old and he was described as having above average intelligence. Just a couple of years earlier, he'd easily passed the 11 plus exams to get into one of the best schools in the area. But once there, he didn't really seem to have much interest in any of his classes apart from chemistry. Graham had always been interested in chemistry. From a very young age, he would show fascination when his parents took drugs if they had a headache or weren't feeling very well. Graham would list out loud each and every element in the drug, but also seemed to show a particular enjoyment in sharing what would happen if they took too much of the drug, how quickly the bad side effects would come on. But hey, he was just a boy who was interested in chemistry and the study of medicine. He was probably going to go on to become a doctor. But he would also steal his stepmom's nail varnish remover and her perfume to analyse the ingredients and really focus on what damage they would cause. I mean, he'd even go as far as stealing old drug bottles from the bins of local chemists. But hey, just interested in chemistry. When he passed his 11 plus exams, his father tried to sort of streamline this interest by buying him a chemistry set. But what Fred didn't quite seem to realise that Graham's knowledge of drugs and poison specifically by this point well surpassed the need for a child's chemistry set. He had a higher level of knowledge than some postgraduate chemistry students. So when the family came down with this horrible bug, it dawned on Fred that something from Graham's chemistry set must have infiltrated the family kitchen. He gave Graham a talking to and asked him to be more careful to make sure that nothing of his chemistry stuff was leaving his bedroom. Graham denied any knowledge of what was happening. He said that he was very careful. But then, in the middle of April 1962, Fred came home for lunch one day to find Molly writhing around in pain in the garden. Graham was watching through the kitchen window, but Fred just assumed that he was too in shock to do anything to help. Molly was rushed to the local hospital, but she would die later that same afternoon, and her cause of death was put down to a road accident she'd had previously been involved in, which caused a prolapsed bone at the top of her spine. Something we now know to be a symptom of long-term antimony poisoning. Molly was cremated just 5 days after her death, Graham seeming to take charge in his family's grief, and he insisted on a quick funeral and cremation. Around the same time, one of Graham's schoolmates, Chris Williams, also started to come down with very similar symptoms. I would say school friend, Graham didn't really have many of those and have many friends, but Chris was probably as close as Graham got to a friend. Graham was a bit of a strange child all around. He was said to be awkward and totally unlike all other boys his age. He showed very little interest in socialising. Other kids literally called him the Mad Professor, a nickname that he loved. To anyone who would listen, all Graham wanted to talk about was his interest in poisons. But if it wasn't poisons, all he wanted to talk about was Hitler and Nazism, something he spoke about with a bit too much passion, especially considering the country was only a couple of decades out from the war. He also idolised William Palmer, a Victorian poisoner who killed 13 people, and he constantly read books about other killers. He also spoke about Satanism and the occult, just a bit too much for comfort. The few friends Graham did have knew that he carried around a vial of poison at all times in his top left pocket, and they also knew how much Graham hated his stepmother, fantasising about how much better his life would be if his biological mother had lived. As you can probably guess where I'm going with this, Graham had poisoned his stepmother. For well over a year, he'd been experimenting with a poison called antimony, giving Molly small doses, but eventually she built up a tolerance to it. So the night before her death, Graham spiked Molly's food with a drug called thallium. He put enough in there to kill multiple people. And although it was never able to be confirmed at the time that this was her cause of death because she was cremated so quickly, Graham would confess many, many years later. Thallium is a chemical element of metal that's highly toxic to humans and other animals alike. It's obtained as a byproduct of smelting other metals, but since the 1970s, many countries have restricted the sale of thallium because of how toxic it is. It used to be a very common ingredient in rat poison, but now you won't really see it around very much. But of course, back in 1962, it was much easier to get hold of, even for children apparently. Graham faked some documents pretending that he was 17 years old and needed the poisons for his studies, so that local chemists would sell them to him. Thallium is particularly lethal because it's soluble in water, it's colourless, odourless and tasteless. You would never know you're ingesting it, but once it's in the body, it attacks your nervous system and your organs. It causes a variety of symptoms: vomiting, diarrhoea, hair loss, headaches, muscle problems, convulsions, delirium, even psychosis. A dose as small as 1 gram can cause death in some, but others can ingest low levels over a very long time and survive. It's not a particularly happy life to lead, but for some it just won't kill you at small doses. For others, a tiny dose will kill you swiftly. Something called antimony was another poison of choice for Graham. It's another metal used in alloys, textiles, enamels, pigments, etc. Following moderate ingestion of antimony, the victim will start showing symptoms within half an hour to 2 hours. They'll get a metallic taste in their mouth, nausea, vomiting, abdominal pain and diarrhoea. If you ingest a substantial amount, the vomit may contain blood and you might get hemorrhagic gastritis. You'll suffer with severe weight loss, peripheral neuropathy, rashes, hypertension, renal failure, coma and convulsions. There's a very good chance you'll end up dying if you keep ingesting antimony, as with any poison. When one of Graham's schoolmates and neighbours, Chris Williams, started to show some of the above symptoms, people started to have some questions. Now, nobody was able to find an answer as to what Chris's illness was caused by, and he was simply diagnosed with having severe migraines and was sent away to deal with them. But of course, that didn't really help. Chris and Graham, it turns out, would often swap sandwiches at school, and Chris's illnesses always seemed to follow the pattern of when he was closer with Graham, although no one at the time questioned this, obviously. I mean, I don't think when anyone is ill, your first thought goes to thallium poisoning by a schoolmate. But with Molly dead, Fred at home suffering on and off with similar symptoms that seemed to have got worse after Molly's death, and now Chris, people started to wonder. People, including Fred, Graham's own father, who refused to let Graham come visit him in hospital. There was also an occasion in late 1961 when Winifred, Graham's sister, had collapsed on her way to work and had to be taken to hospital. She said that her tea had tasted incredibly bitter that morning, so much so that she'd only been able to take a single sip. And thank God, because doctors soon found that she had ingested belladonna, also known as deadly nightshade. Winifred simply accused her brother of being careless with his chemistry experiments. She didn't assume that he'd spiked her tea on purpose. And it was an experiment for sure, but it definitely wasn't accidental. Graham's own aunt started to sense that something was off, as did his science teacher, who I'm sure saw the full brunt of his students' poison obsession. The science teacher searched Graham's desk on an evening and found a number of concerning things inside, including some very macabre drawings of coffins and death. They called in a psychiatrist to have a meeting at school with Graham, under the guise of it being a meeting with a careers advisor. The psychiatrist was immediately concerned. This was not your standard 14-year-old boy, and he actually reported his findings to the police. When he was confronted, the vial of antimony he carried around in his top pocket fell out, and he very soon confessed to what he'd been doing. He said it was like a drug habit, only it wasn't him taking the drugs, it was the people closest to him. Enough poison to kill 300 people was soon found in all of Graham's hiding places. Graham's case was taken to trial at the Old Bailey on the 6th of July 1962, where he pleaded guilty to poisoning his sister, father and school friend Chris Williams. The consulting psychiatrist reported that Graham was a very serious danger to society, and that his intense obsession with drugs and poison was not likely to ever change. If he was allowed free, he would continue poisoning people with very little remorse. He was also found to have a lack of moral sense, what we might call a sociopath today. The judge ordered that Graham was to be detained in Broadmoor and not released for at least 15 years, and even then it was only to be with the direct approval of the Home Secretary. At just 14.5 years old, Graham Young was the youngest person to be detained at Broadmoor at this time, which is possibly UK's most infamous psychiatric hospital. It's certainly the oldest. Graham was given his own cell in the reception block, away from the main block and the general population of the hospital. I mean, he was a child after all. His family visited when they could, but eventually this stopped. All he would do is repeatedly ask for poisons, repeatedly ask for matches. They eventually realised that for somebody with the right knowledge, it is very possible to make poison out of matches. Eventually Graham was given a job in the kitchens at Broadmoor, and I would love to know who thought that was a good idea. Let's put an avid poisoner in the kitchen and give him access to everyone's food. Of course his job in there didn't last long when the nurse's coffee was soon found to contain toilet cleaner. Graham often told psychiatrists that he missed his poisons, he missed antimony, he missed the power it gave him. And then one day, another patient died of cyanide poisoning, despite there being no access to cyanide anywhere in the hospital grounds. Graham would kind of confess to this, saying that he'd extracted the poison from plants found in the ground of the hospital. But ultimately, the patient's death would be noted down as a suicide, so we don't know for sure if Graham was responsible for this or not. Graham spent 9 years of the ordered 15 in Broadmoor before being released, despite what had gone on whilst he was in there. As the years went on, the mysterious poisonings would stop, and he eventually became somewhat of a model prisoner or model hospital patient. But Graham was biding his time, playing at behaving, until in June 1970, after nearly 8 years in Broadmoor, the psychiatrist wrote to the Home Secretary to recommend his release, saying that Graham had changed, he no longer had an interest in poisons. It was now safe for him to be out in the world once again. When Graham heard the news, he told a nurse that he planned to kill one person for every year he'd spent in the hospital, and yet he was still released. By the beginning of 1971, the Home Office had agreed to release now 23-year-old Graham early, provided he went through further treatment on the outside. He was sent to live with his sister Winifred temporarily in Hemel Hempstead, who believed what the hospital had told her about her brother, that he was cured. He no longer was a danger to society, nor to her. It seems like a bit of wishful thinking. I'm not sure I would be brave enough to let a known poisoner come and live with me and have access to all my food, but he was her baby brother. She wanted to believe that he was going to be okay. Then he was sent to a government training centre in Slough, where he would go on to receive a qualification in store management. Only very weirdly, other people in the course seemed to come down with a horrific stomach bug whilst he was there. One man, Trevor Sparks, with whom Graham stayed with at a local hostel, was described as having diabolical pains and his legs eventually stopped working. Another man would die by suicide after suffering with a long and unexplained illness that caused horrific pains. We don't know for sure if Graham had a hand in this, but the timing is quite suspect. You can make assumptions. With his new qualification, Graham applied for a job as a store clerk at a photographic instruments company in Bovington, Hertfordshire. The company was called Hadlands, and he explained away his lack of experience by saying his mother had died when he was a teenager and he'd experienced a nervous breakdown in the aftermath. When the manager asked for references, he was directed to Graham's Broadmoor psychiatrist, who didn't fully share what Graham had been in there for. The reply they got stated, Young had suffered a personality disorder necessitating hospitalisation throughout the whole of his adolescence. He has made a full recovery and is fit for discharge. There was no mention whatsoever of his proclivity towards poisons or the fact he had poisoned his whole family, potentially killing his stepmother. It was said that Graham was conscientious in his work, he was always paying attention to the small details, he would be a good employee. Even colleagues at Hadlands would later state that although Graham was a bit odd, he never really upset anyone, he just kept himself to himself and got on with the job. Although they did say that general conversation with him did usually tend to veer towards the macabre, and he was always talking about Hitler. Graham slowly but surely did make friends with some of his colleagues, mostly the older men who took young 23-year-old Graham under their wing. But what nobody knew is by this point, Graham had already started building up his stockpile of poisons again, using the same fake ID and name he'd used as a teenager. He would travel down to London pharmacies and buy his poisons of choice, antimony and thallium amongst others. Hadlands, being a photographic company, actually did have a large number of poisons on site, and they even manufactured thallium infrared lenses, but no actual thallium was stored on site. Graham could have had very easy access here, but not that he particularly needed it, he knew where to find his poisons. But what was one of Graham's main jobs at this company? Collecting drinks for everyone from the tea trolley twice a day, making sure that each employee got their drinks in their correct mugs, each of them having their own. The poisoning started pretty soon after Graham joined the company. It was just too easy, slipping antimony or thallium into his colleagues' drinks. Soon, a lot of employees at Hadlands started to come down with a mysterious illness, all suffering similar symptoms: vomiting, diarrhoea, stomach pains. The illness was dubbed the Bovington bug, as people tried to figure out the cause, thinking it was a virus. Some suspected that the local water supply, or at least the supply into Hadlands, was contaminated. Others suspected it could have been caused by radioactive experiments that had been happening at a nearby disused airfield. One of the people who got most ill was 59-year-old Bob Eagle, a Dunkirk veteran who Graham seemed to take a real shine to, asking endless questions about the war. It's thought that he started poisoning Bob around the June, so just a number of weeks after he joined the company, and soon Bob had to take several days off for diarrhoea and severe stomach pains. He'd always recover after a few days off of work, but the symptoms would soon reappear after he returned back. Another employee called Ron Hewitt started to suffer with the same symptoms, but he was told by doctors that he had food poisoning. Ron got better, but then returned back to work and got ill again. He eventually ended up leaving the company and never suffered any symptoms again. Bob Eagle, sadly, wasn't so lucky. One day Bob's fingers went numb and eventually paralysis took over his whole body as he was rushed to the ICU at St Albans City Hospital. Eventually Bob couldn't even speak. After 10 days in hospital, on the 7th of July 1971, Bob sadly died. Throughout those 10 days in hospital, Graham would regularly call the ward to check in and see how Bob was doing, as any concerned friend would do. However, we now know that Graham didn't care about Bob, he was just intrigued to see the effects of his poison. The post-mortem struggled to pinpoint a cause of death, but it was eventually put down as a rare form of polyneuritis, also called Guillain-Barré syndrome. I see the thought process there. The syndrome causes rapid onset muscle weakness caused by the immune system damaging the peripheral nervous syndrome. It didn't explain everything, but it kind of explained some things. Graham was upset by his friend's death, or at least it seemed so on the outside. He remarked how sad it was that Bob should come through the terrors of Dunkirk only to fall victim to some strange virus. But he didn't let up with Bob's death, of course. As a result, he was actually promoted to head storeman, and he did seem to behave a little bit better for at least a little bit. He would say that in the coming weeks he would only poison his co-worker Diana Smart's tea with a small dose of antimony when she annoyed him. Compared to Bob, Diana got off lucky. Another colleague to fall victim to Graham though was 39-year-old Jethro Batt. He was chatting one day with Graham, who remarked how easy it was to poison someone and make it look like natural causes. Then shortly after that conversation, he made Jethro a cup of tea that tasted very bitter. Jethro took one sip and threw the rest away, saying it was undrinkable, and Graham laughed, saying, "So you think I'm trying to poison you?" Both the men laughed. Of course, Graham wasn't trying to poison Jethro, but the timing was weird. And then afterwards, Jethro started being sick. He was in so much agony that night, stomach and leg pains, that he told his wife he wanted to die. He wanted to shoot himself to get rid of the pain. And this pain would continue over the coming weeks. His hair started falling out and he started to suffer with hallucinations. The illness was never ending. Another colleague, David Tilson, also started to suffer with similar symptoms, admitted to hospital with numb legs, breathing difficulties and chest pains. His hair also all fell out and he couldn't stand anything touching his skin. He eventually recovered but was left permanently impotent as a result of this. Jethro Batt would also luckily recover. The last victim at Hadlands was 56-year-old Fred Biggs. He'd been suffering on and off with the symptoms of the Bovington bug for many months, but by November 1972 it had reached a peak. Unknown to Fred, Graham had been poisoning his drinks with antimony for months. He was taken to hospital in Hemel Hempstead, but it's reported his skin literally started to peel off his body. 7 different doctors looked at him with no answers before he was eventually transferred to a specialist hospital, the National Hospital for Nervous Diseases, where he sadly ended up dying on the 19th of November. By the time of his death, he couldn't speak or breathe. Like with Bob Eagle before him, Graham had shown great concern whilst Fred was in the hospital, continually calling the hospital and Fred's wife to check in on him. With so many ill and now 2 deaths of people within the company, Hadlands called in factory inspectors to make sure nothing on site was causing the illnesses, and they found nothing to be concerned about. They called a meeting of management and staff at the company to see if they were able to get to the bottom of it, including calling in the firm's GP, Dr. Anderson. Dr. Anderson reportedly actually ruled out contamination by heavy metal during this meeting, but then Graham himself piped up, questioning as to whether the symptoms were consistent with thallium poisoning. After the meeting, Dr. Anderson spoke to Graham one-on-one, who boasted at length about his knowledge of toxicology, and this was enough to raise some alarm bells. John Hadland, the company owner, contacted the police off the back of this, saying that he suspected Graham might be poisoning his employees. It didn't take long for the police to get to the bottom of what had been going on, quickly noting that the illnesses had started not long after Graham Young had joined the company. He was for sure knowledgeable about toxicology, but he wasn't all that good at covering his tracks. Scotland Yard were contacted to check if any of the employees at Hadland had a criminal record, and only then did the truth about Graham's past come out, that 9 years before he'd poisoned his sister, father and a school friend, all of whom had luckily survived. The truth about his stay at Broadmoor also was finally uncovered, that he was released 6 years before it was recommended, that he was always said to be at risk of poisoning more people. Upon realising this, the police very quickly raced to the bedsit where Graham lived, and when they found that he wasn't there, they went to his sister's home where he wasn't either. Eventually, Graham was arrested at his father's house by local police in Sheerness, Kent. In his bedsit, police found the walls covered with pictures of Hitler and other Nazi leaders, as well as bottles and vials of poison in every single nook and cranny. It's said that even when he was arrested, Graham was found to have a vial of thallium in his jacket pocket. In this bedsit, they found false letters of authorisation in which he pretended to be a medical researcher to get hold of poison. As well as all this, they also found a diary in which Graham noted down all of his experiments, the time at which he administered each dose of poison, and the initials of who he gave it to. It was a log. It contained all the information investigators needed. In questioning, Graham was found to be arrogant and unconcerned. He seemed very ready to admit his guilt, but then refused to sign the written statement once there was one. He told the chief superintendent of his victims, "I had ceased to see them as people, they became guinea pigs." In his diary, the only thing he expressed remorse for was the poisoning of Jethro Batt, saying he felt rather ashamed in his action. Why Jethro? I don't really know. Although Graham refused to sign this written confession, they didn't really need it. They had enough evidence in his bedsit to prove his guilt. But they just needed to be sure, so exhumation of Fred Biggs's body was organised to prove that he had died from thallium poisoning, and of course testing came back proving that he had. It was a bit more complicated in the case of Bob Eagle, who had been cremated, but the police recovered the casket containing his ashes and they tested his ashes. Sure enough, they found evidence of thallium poisoning even in those. This was the first time in British legal history that evidence was procured from cremated ashes, as well as being the first time in recorded British history that thallium had been used as a poison, as a murder weapon. On the 3rd of December 1971, Graham was charged with both murders. The police also reopened inquiries into the death of his stepmother, Molly Young, and although they weren't able to confirm anything so many years on, they did talk to local library staff to where Graham had grown up, saying that they recalled that he was constantly in reading books about poisons. At one point the staff asked Graham to pop out and buy them some rolls from the bakers, and they all became ill not long after this. The trial began at St Albans Crown Court on Monday the 19th of June 1972, in which he faced charges for the murders of Bob Eagle and Fred Biggs, as well as the attempted murders of David Tilson and Jethro Batt, and the malicious poisoning of other colleagues as well. He pled not guilty, saying he had no motive to poison anyone. He said he'd only previously confessed to end the interviews with the police as he wanted to go and read his books. At trial, the widows of Fred and Bob took the witness stand and revealed harrowing accounts of their husbands' last few days, the pain they suffered through. One of the dispensers at a London chemist identified Graham Young as the man who had bought poison from him. But all of this was just circumstantial. They had no actual evidence to prove that Graham took poison and gave it to his colleagues, which causes a problem when the jury couldn't also be told about his past poisonings, his past in Broadmoor. The prosecutor told the court that Graham didn't need a motive to poison anyone, that his sheer fascination in watching the progress of the poisoning was enough. In the end, the entire trial weighed on what the jury thought of his diaries, which Graham said that he was using to write a novel. Apparently they had nothing to do with the poisonings that exactly coincided with the information inside. Luckily, the jury weren't stupid, and on the 29th of June deliberated for only 1.5 hours before returning with a guilty verdict on almost all counts. He was found guilty of 2 counts of murder, 2 counts of attempted murder, and 2 counts of administering poison with intent to injury. He was found not guilty for administering poison to 2 other colleagues and was acquitted on all 4 counts of administering poison with intent to cause grievous bodily harm. He was sentenced to life in prison for his crimes, and Graham himself requested to be sent to an actual prison rather than be returned to Broadmoor, and this request was granted. He was sent to HM Prison Park Lane in Maghull, Merseyside, but that did eventually merge into Ashworth Hospital, which just so happened to be another one of the country's 3 high-security psychiatric hospitals, so he did end up back in a proper hospital. There was question as to whether or not Graham would show off his knowledge of poisons to the doctor at Hadlands if he was the one doing it. Some people said that surely he wouldn't be that stupid. Only, as we see with killers time and time again, some of them have to be noticed for what they're doing. They have to have that notoriety. Graham wanted to become known as a poisoner, and for that to happen, he had to make it known what he was doing. He also had to have people know of his intelligence. What was the point of doing all this if nobody was going to find out? During his stay in prison, he continued with his poisoning. It was just something he was completely unable to refrain from. There was one poison he was able to make out of everyday items, a poison that was said to have no antidote. I couldn't find any further information on this, but I probably shouldn't share how to make poisons out of everyday items on such a platform anyway. He had to be moved from his cell because of this, and then from then on he would be moved irregularly and have his cells completely searched top to bottom. Graham Young ended up dying on the 1st of August 1990, aged 42, in Pankhurst Prison on the Isle of Wight. He was moved there after accusing staff at Ashworth of, ironically, overdosing him. At the inquest, his cause of death was noted as myocardial infarction, a heart attack. And you might find yourself thinking that 42 years old is very young to have a heart attack, and generally it is quite young. Graham Young had no history of heart disease, he seemed relatively healthy, so his death has been subject to plenty of speculation over the years. Some suspect he committed suicide using the poisons he loved so much on himself, or some think he was potentially murdered by prisoners or prison staff who didn't feel safe in his vicinity, but there's never been an actual answer there. It was said at trial that had Graham Young remained at Broadmoor, the deaths of Bob Eagle and Fred Biggs never would have happened. Had he remained where he was supposed to, for the time he was supposed to, they would have lived the remainder of their lives in peace. Had management at Hadlands been told the truth of Graham's history, they likely never would have hired him, knowing the kinds of materials he would have had access to on site. Or maybe they would have given him a chance, but as soon as people started to get ill, they would have known what was going on and been able to deal with it then and put a stop to it. The psychiatrist at Broadmoor who decided to hold back the truth of Graham's time there is as much to blame for the deaths as Graham is, if you ask me. Hadlands weren't told, they were simply told that he'd been completely cured of a personality disorder, there was no risk to anyone at all. As a result of all this, a review of procedures for releasing offenders from psychiatric hospitals was ordered. More safeguards were to be put in place before the release of mentally ill offenders, and no patient at special hospitals such as Broadmoor was to be discharged without recommendation from at least 2 psychiatrists. The supervision of released patients was to be improved upon as well. It was found that Graham never received a single visit from his probation worker after his release. These things being put in place has probably saved the lives of many more people in the years since. New laws were also put in place regarding the sale of poisons such as thallium and antimony. It's incredibly difficult to get hold of nowadays, thank God. Honestly, I did start googling how to get hold of thallium in the UK, but I decided against it. It seems like that would be something that's on a government watch list somewhere, and I'm not about to get the government watching me. But I trust all the sources I used when they said that thallium and antimony and general poisons are incredibly hard to get hold of now. So there you go, that is the story of Graham Young, the teacup poisoner, the Bovington poisoner, the St Albans poisoner, whatever you want to call him. On the back of his capture, hopefully nothing like this will ever happen in the UK again. Hopefully it will never happen in the world. On the back of his capture and the new laws that were put in place, hopefully nothing like this will ever happen in the UK again. Thank you so much for tuning in today, and I will see you in the next one. Bye guys.